We said it's really bad news if we go past 1.5. Welcome to the post 1.5 world.
The central narrative challenge that we've got here is that the world is crossing 1.5. And so what do you do when you've organized your whole climate policy and all of the countries have been arguing over how to deliver 1.5, and 1.5 is now potentially in the rearview mirror?
If you use the IPCC definition, then we're only going to find out that we breached 1.5 after 20 years. So that has been a shortfall with 1.5 degree.
Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops! I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. So welcome to another episode of Saving the World from Bad Ideas. We've got a very special show today because we are launching a paper in Nature. So we are leading the world's agenda on a whole new proposal for how we measure the impact of our actions to try to tackle climate change. It's both simple and complicated at the same time. And I'm here with my two co-authors who I will ask to introduce themselves, and starting with the lead author, which is you, Kwesi.
Yeah, so my name is Kwesi Quagraine. I am originally from Ghana. I am a climate scientist at NCAR at the moment. I was a senior lecturer at the University of Cape Coast, teaching and lecturing in physics and meteorology and atmospheric science. So that's a bit about me. And of course, it's been a pleasure working with you both on this paper.
Over to you, Earl.
Hi, I'm Erle Ellis, and I'm a professor of geography and environmental systems at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And I come to this project through some work that I've been doing with the United Nations Development Program's Human Development Report, which involves indicators that are aspirational about making a better future for people on this planet.
So it's worth saying that this show, of course, is about saving the world from bad ideas. And what we're proposing with this new paper is a good idea, but we need to respect the format. So the bad idea that we're challenging, perhaps, is that the key metric around which climate policy is organized is the average global temperature target. So this is probably a good place to start off our conversation, because it's why we started off with the paper, and it's what we want to potentially challenge and change. And of course, the organizing principle since even before Paris, the climate COP in 2015, which popularized this idea of a global average temperature target of 1.5 degrees. And that was, taken up by the vulnerable countries, the small island states. They had this slogan, 1.5 to stay alive. And Earl, why did we originally decide that this wasn't such a good idea?
Yes, indeed. This, again, has to do with the work I've been doing to look at, what kind of stories are we telling about the future for the planet that, basically so far is just talked about as a kind of crisis. And the solution is just simply to avoid the crisis, rather than the kinds of narratives we tell when we're trying to get cooperation going at larger scales internationally to achieve something together. And so these kind of aspirational narratives, like, let's eliminate smallpox. We can do this. We have the capabilities. If we cooperate, we can achieve this. If we want to phase out something like ozone depleting chemicals, like the CFCs, this involves getting together to do something to make something better. And so that's the kind of narrative I've been thinking about with climate for quite a long time. And the only narratives we seem to get are, let's avoid getting the planet too hot. Let's stop burning fossil fuels, which we do have to do. But the narrative that will really excite people, in my mind, has always been, what is the different future that we're trying to get? And that's a future that's powered by clean energy. That's ultimately where we want to go. And so why aren't we focusing our attention on that instead of this target that, in fact, we've already exceeded, right? We've said it's really bad news if we go past 1.5. Welcome to the post 1.5 world. At this time, right? What should we be thinking about if we're trying to get people to work together on a common project that will make this world a better place, and in particular, end global climate change? And so that's where we got started.
Absolutely. So the central narrative challenge that we've got here is that the world is crossing 1.5. And so what do you do when you've organized your whole climate policy and all of the countries have been arguing over how to deliver 1.5, and 1.5 is now potentially in the rearview mirror? The new WMO, World Meteorological Organization figures came out at the beginning of January. I think for the last 3 years, on average, it's been 1.48, so perilously close, like just 0.2 of a degree off the 1.5 level. There was a whole 18-month period. I think the whole of 2024 was above 1.5. It was 1.55, wasn't it, Kwesi? And even if we take the sort of IPCC definition of the midpoint of a 20-year average, we're looking at that well before 2030. So, Kwesi, what was your take on the average temperature global targets and, what we should do with the 1.5 challenge?
That's pretty interesting because as a climate scientist, it was always hard to come back to this. And in discussions, first of all, temperature targets were sort of intangible in the sense that for most people, what is a temperature target? It's about the risk and the impact that's associated with the temperature target that is really important. And for policymakers, they couldn't translate that into clear actions. If you ask any policymaker, what policy did you inform from the Paris Agreement in 2015? They could tell you that, well, we couldn't do much about it because that measure was so intangible. And we had to shift the focus. And that's where this paper really shines by bringing in something tangible that policymakers can really relate to. So from a climate science perspective, yes, if you use a IPCC definition, then we're only going to find out that we breached 1.5 after 20 years. And you can imagine how that will be when we've already crossed this threshold. And after 20 years, only then could we determine that, we did cross 1.5 in somewhere 2030. That is crazy in itself for driving policy. So that has been a shortfall with 1.5 degree temperature target. So for our paper, shifting that narrative to the clean energy shift metric was really essential to communicate that to policymakers. And I'm sure they would appreciate this metric here.
And we'll explain what that is properly in just a minute. But just while we're still on the issue of the global average temperature, I mean, a fallback could be, if we stick with global average temperature, it could be 1.6. I mean, 1.6 to stay alive doesn't quite rhyme. Neither does 1.7. The Paris goals also had 2 degrees. I mean, it was, I think, well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to reach 1.5. I can't remember the exact language in the agreement, but 2 degrees is just as central, but it seems like a very long way to fall back if you're arguing on behalf of a vulnerable country to say, okay, 1.5 is over, let's fall all the way back to 2 degrees. I mean, what does the science say about the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees? Is there a definite hard limit where we should say, for the sake of the ice sheets, for the sake of the coral reefs, for the sake of the Amazon rainforest, this is where we should stop in terms of stopping the, assuming it was even possible, but stopping the rising temperature of the globe?
That's a great point. Is there actually any hard line that divides the world between, safety and danger? That's a concept that's kind of been used to simplify the challenges of the way that people are changing the planet and what we should do about it. And this idea that we now operate in this kind of safe space within which everything's fine as long as you don't pass some sort of planetary boundary, that kind of model for understanding how we can interact with the planet in a positive way is limited by one simple fact, is that there are no such boundaries. Scientists will only know in the very far future, looking back, if and when we push past some of these so-called tipping points in the Earth system, beyond which a return to the past, for example, you could imagine there may well be a tipping point for some aspect of the Earth system, say, the Greenland ice sheet might be committed to melting at 1.5 degrees. Nobody knows this exact number, and they'll only be able to determine this looking back from the deep future. So the idea that we can simply understand things in terms of these boundaries is a basic problem with communicating the state of the science. We will never know exactly where these boundaries are until it's way too late. And 1.5 is actually a response of policymakers to the behavior of our societies around the world to the 2-degree safety limit that was set earlier by climate scientists who were basically at 2 degrees, climate scientists cannot tell you what is going to happen. Things get dangerous then. in terms of it's there be dragons. We don't know what happens at 2 degrees. It starts to become worse and worse news. At 1.5, we're still kind of in the realm of ordinary climate behavior, ordinary climate modeling and understanding. So the idea of 1.5 was instituted because what happens when people think, no problem until you hit 2 degrees? They don't do anything until you're near 2 degrees. And so 1.5 degrees is kind of a safety valve, a way of kind of producing a reaction from climate policy people before you hit 2 degrees. And now that we've passed this, the unfortunate thing is to make that 1.5 degrees narrative viable, you have to say something bad happens after 1.5 degrees. Otherwise, who cares? And so now that we're past 1.5 degrees, the narrative is going to shift inevitably to we are now past the safety limit, and the policymakers and governments failed to protect us from global climate change. And so what's going to happen next is not really, in a sense, policymakers have lost control of their narrative as we move into this unknown territory past the 1.5 safety mark that they set. And so what do you do now that can actually engage people in something that we can do together? It's certainly not going to be saying, oh, we're past 1.5, now we have to pull back.
Yeah, it's a pretty untenable position for a policymaker to be in. I mean, lost control of a narrative, like you just said, is actually a good way of putting it, because how can you sit there in a COP or in a climate negotiation and say, we must keep to 1.5 when you're already over the level, and it's in hindsight. Kwesi, you tell us what I know you, because I know you've done a lot of climate science work on this. What's your feeling about the global average temperature issue?
Yeah, I think global average temperature typically masks regional responses and impacts. And that is what we missed as climate scientists. For instance, the fact that we have a global temperature average of 1.5 degrees doesn't necessarily mean Europe is experiencing an average temperature of 1.5 degrees. So the regional impact could be higher or lower than the global impact. And I think, as Erle said with clarity, the difference between that 1.5 degree and then going to 2 degrees is just about the impact, the proportion of the impact that we were going to experience. And truly, as a mitigating factor, climate scientists and policymakers that time in 2015 thought that, okay, why not bridge the gap by saying 1.5? Let's act towards 1.5, because we know that the 2 degree temperature target, when reached or breached, is going to be very dire. And in essence, global temperature average is not an efficient way of measuring impact at all. And I have found that a little bit in the science even. There's this analysis that we do when we want to measure efficacy. And you find the average temperature over a grid box, and then you literally divide by the global temperature to get that regional response. But in essence, that is a little bit flawed, because you are using a measure that doesn't necessarily translate to the regional impact of the region of interest. So that was always flawed in terms of how we're going to get that regional responses, because the regional responses are very different. When you go to Africa, the temperatures are probably even higher than the 1.5 global mean surface temperature over the same period, but the regional impact will be different.
I'm gonna add on to what Kwesi said too. So I teach introduction to environmental science, have for years, and we talk about a lot of different environmental challenges, water pollution, species extinctions, all these things. And to be honest, it was always the hardest to talk about climate change, because the number one thing that everyone wants to talk about is how it impacts them personally. That's the number one thing that gets people talking. And with climate change, it was always very vague. It's very hard to attach a specific consequence to, my classroom full of students in a way that was really useful. And that's partly because of this fact that, right, like the global temperature is not really affecting anyone in particular. Like 1.5, 1.6, 1.7, what's the difference for me? It's really, really vague. It's not something you can control. There's no like knob on the planet where you can turn the temperature up and down, and that the policymakers need to push one way instead of the other way. And that's the problem, right? It's not really an actionable thing, and it's not a very tangible thing. It's not something that we can do something about. And that makes it very difficult to connect with the students that I was teaching. But the same holds for everybody, I think, on the planet. It's less tangible as what are we going to do, not just, what are we worried about? What are we going to do? And that's, I think, the number one reason why this approach gives us a lot of more possibilities and a lot more capabilities.
Yeah. I mean, the expectation, I think, with 1.5 or 2 degrees or whatever it was that would then kind of cascade down into the efforts of all of the countries through their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, which was their own plans for their emissions going forward into the future. And that collectively added together would give some kind of global average temperature outcome, which could gradually, if you increased ambition, be reconciled with 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or whatever. The problem is that if you add together all of these NDCs, these emissions plans, you're actually closer to 3 degrees, or if not above, according to most projections. And actually, Earl, I want to come back and take this to you, Kwesi. The issue of, Earl, you said there's no thermostat. I mean, people think of maybe carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases in total as a kind of thermostat which controls the temperature of the planet. But even then, it's more complicated than that, because there's other forcings. There's changes in the sun. There's natural variability. There's the reflectivity of the planet. And actually, Kwesi, that's something you've worked on, right? I mean, if you want to physically determine the temperature of the planet in a shorter space of time, we'd do what you've been modeling, which is solar radiation management, aka solar geoengineering. Tell us a bit about just how that would work and why it's probably not such a good idea to do right now.
Well, my funders will not be happy with me. Yeah, but I mean, I think it's a little bit of a trade-off in terms of the thermostat. In fact, what science even shows is that water vapor actually is a real thermostat of the planet as well. Water vapor. We tend to sort of misinterpret that. And I mean, if we want to control the temperature as we've modeled with from volcanoes and etc. into solar geoengineering, that is perfectly doable. But what we don't know is the regional impact of that action. We know for a fact that the chemistry is solid in what will happen if we spray sulfur aerosols into the stratosphere. We know it will warm up, it will interact with the particles in the stratosphere. We know it will reflect some portion of the sunlight back into space. But the end goal is what happens to the climate. Yes, we'll cool the temperature. It's easy to control the temperature. But then the regional impact on marine wildlife, ecosystems, even precipitation is very, very, very difficult to determine. And that is one thing that we as people studying the science of solar geoengineering, we never want to advocate for solar geoengineering, because when do we start? How long does it take? How much do we spray? Even the particles that there's a research going on in my lab looking at multiple particles, different materials that we could spray. And fun fact, diamond seems to be very effective. So if we'll be sending all our diamonds into the stratosphere, that would be really interesting. And the cost involved, even the aeroplanes that we have to fly, the nozzles that has to spray, Silver Lynas working on something like that. And these are all challenges and barriers that has to be broken to be even sure to be able to do it. And the sustainability of it. How long do we do it? When do we terminate it? What is going to happen? So I think there's a lot of uncertainties with that. And we have to work hard to phase out fossil fuels. That in itself is clear to everyone, since these fossil fuel companies had even hired scientists to do this work in the 70s and had found and projected accurately how the world was going to warm if we go on unabated. So yeah, it's a challenge to determine which the thermostat is, but we have to do this in concert with a lot of sense to be able to get the thermostat down in a way.
But if you really believe that 1.5 was the life or death limit, then greenhouse gas emissions isn't the way to actually achieve that. It probably would be solar geoengineering in the short term, right? I mean, that's the physically most plausible way to actually alter the planet's energy balance on a year-to-year basis. Is that what you're saying?
Well, this is one of these classic examples of fixing a problem with a bigger problem. And that is something that human societies have lived on, that strategy for a very long time. It's not a new thing that to solve one problem, we create a bigger problem. But I think this is a classic example of that. There's no reason that we are committed to managing the planet's climate. The planet could take care of its climate perfectly well without us. And now here we are in this situation where, because we can't somehow push back on the richest people in the world who are burning all this fossil fuel and causing this problem, because we won't do that, because we won't eliminate this very profitable activity, we are going to start managing the entire climate system. I mean, that's a very poor way of addressing the challenge, which is ultimately a social challenge of those who are causing a severe pollution problem that is harming everyone. Those people need to address their problem. And of course, it's very nice just to say, okay, stop burning fossil fuels. That's a very nice thing to say. But the reality is that we're almost all of us dependent on cheap energy. Cheap energy is what makes our modern lives possible. And so we're not just going to give that up. That idea is a kind of a fantasy. So what are we going to do to deal with this pollution problem? Clean energy. We have to clean up our energy system. Most of that fossil fuel, most of the climate change caused by burning of fossil fuels is just about the energy system. There's other sources.
One of the things the scientists are proposing now is actually overshoot, which seems to me to be rather a hopeful strategy, that we can allow ourselves to just fail for 1.5, presumably for a period of a few decades, and then, optimistically come back down below that temperature. I mean, that might be something that happens if we ramp up clean energy fast enough and eliminate fossils from the system fast enough. But to have that as a strategy and have that as an organizing principle of overshoot seems to me to be the wrong approach. Kwesi, what do you think on that?
Well, I totally agree with you. It's like taking a gamble in itself. Yes, we exceed 1.5 degree, and we sort of want to say that we temporarily exceeded and then we later bring it back. But what is the guarantee? That has always been the question with overshoot. What is the guarantee? Even now, we are trying to return the climate to the pre-industrial levels, at least 1.5 degree above pre-industrial. We've not been able to achieve that. We failed. So why take the risk of going into an overshoot and thinking that you'd be able to bring it back? So I think that is the crux of the whole overshoot scenario. Yeah.
I'd actually like to say one more thing about this idea about overshoot as well. The whole idea that the problem that we have is we're not managing the temperature properly, and we need a group of experts to tell us exactly how to get there. And that's the challenge that we face, is a real fantasy. The challenge that we face is that people around the world want cheap energy, and fossil fuels are delivering most of that cheap energy. And we need a solution to that challenge. We need to find a way to build energy systems, and we already have found this way. We need to roll out the technology we have to clean up the energy system. That is the real challenge, not the fact that the temperature is not being managed correctly. If we look at this as a planetary temperature challenge alone, the real solution is the one we just talked about. Just turn up the knob or turn down the knob with sulfate aerosols. You become managers of the planet's temperature rather than people that are trying to make their societies function as they should, where people who are polluting the planet have to stop what they're doing and redo.
That's a perfect segue to the new proposal that we're humbly putting in front of the world's climate community, scientists, policymakers, literally everyone, all of you listening to this podcast. Instead of this global average temperature target, now that we've missed it and we don't want to fall back on something else, and it's not necessarily the right metric to go for. So what we're proposing is to shift the goalposts entirely and talk about a different thing altogether, which is the rate at which clean energy is potentially displacing fossil energy going forward. Kwesi, as lead author, do you want to take the lead in explaining this new metric?
Well, that's thanks for giving me this onerous job. Yeah, so I think that when we started this paper, we had a very simple idea that evolved over time, and also in our understanding of the landscape. For instance, we came to conclusion that growth rate in clean energy minus the growth rate in total energy demand is our clean energy shift. And so if we take an example of, let's say, if we are growing 6% annually, clean energy grows 6% annually, total demand grows about 3%, then the shift is what? 6 minus 3, which means plus 3%. And then we said the bigger the number, the faster we exit fossil fuels from the system. And I think there's been a lot of challenges on how to even calculate the total energy demand. I mean, the total energy has always been a problem with how people even interpret it. If you ask two energy experts, they will tell you two different ways of calculating that. And that in itself is a challenge, because if you can estimate the total energy in absolute terms, then it's very difficult to even ascertain what clean energy shift is. So I think our method, or our suggested metric, has its own challenges, but it's a step in the right direction, I should say, for us to be able to achieve this. And we think that measuring this displacement is a way of consciously acting towards getting to a clean, total clean energy system. So yeah.
We should say at this point that we're building on a concept that was originally proposed by Michael Liebreich, who is a veteran of this podcast and is also host of his own podcast called Cleaning Up, which I highly recommend. And he put forward this concept as a sort of illustrative part of one of his recent pieces of writing called The Pragmatic Climate Reset, I think it was called. Amazing essay. You should definitely go and read it. But we were building this out in a way which is actually proposing it as a real-time metric for policymakers to focus on, weren't we all?
The place where we started was the big picture. What does this better future look like? And the better future looks like a planet where we have 100% clean energy. That's ultimately the target. When can we get there? How do we get there? That's a big challenge, and it's not going to take 5 years. It's going to take a generation to get there. But that's the big picture. And so, simple metric. Percent clean energy. What percentage of our energy is clean? And that seems like a very simple thing. And it should be a very simple thing. But the reality is, computing this is actually amazingly complex, because the way that we generate the energy that we use changes at the same time that your demand for the energy is changing. And it turns out that means that it's not a simple thing to calculate even percent clean energy. And that's the fundamental thing at the beginning of the calculation, right? Is how do you do that? And then you can do a percent change in the rate of clean energy. That's where we started. That's a simple idea, right? We should accelerate our change in percent of clean energy. But we had to deal with one more problem. And this is where Liebreich's idea comes in, is that if the whole energy system is demanding more and more energy, and it's meeting that demand not using clean energy, you can still have an increasing percent clean energy and have more emissions of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel combustion. And so you're not really decarbonizing. So you have a kind of a relative improvement, but not the absolute improvement that we need to end global climate change. And so that was the challenge, is, how do you put all that together? And that's this idea of the clean energy shift, which actually puts it all together. But at the very roots, the complexity here comes from the fact that there's really a lot of things changing at the same time in the way that we produce and consume energy that are changing all the time as well. And depending on how you calculate it, you get different numbers. And without a global standard for those numbers, we're not even going to be able to say, what is the world's percent clean energy? Something as simple as that we need to get to 100%. We'll probably be able to prove that. But along the way, how do we track our progress? Very simple, basic thing that we need to do. It's not easy to do. Good news is that people like Liebreich and Ember and some other groups, even the IEA, are starting to work harder to address this challenge, to come up with a global standard measure of clean energy. And when that happens, the clean energy shift will be easy to calculate. But right now, it remains difficult because of that lack of standardization in the way that we measure clean energy.
Yeah, because clean energy shift, as I think about it, Kwesi's explained the maths, is the rate at which clean energy is outgrowing the total increase in energy use. And so you can sort of think, well, that sort of logically stands to reason that if clean energy is growing faster than total, sooner or later, the residual, which is fossil, will be squeezed off the system right the way down to zero. And it's the rate at which that's happening, the clean energy shift, which is the number that needs to keep increasing, or at least to maintain a high level. And so we're proposing that could be the central focus for policymakers. But as you say, if we don't know for sure what the number is, because there's different ways of quantifying energy use, that's a problem. And so part of the point of this paper actually is to set the research agenda, or at least to advance the research agenda to the extent that we can settle on some more substantive numbers which actually make this metric more solid. And part of the problem we've got is, I mean, Michael's Lieberich explained this in his own podcast as well, is the issue of primary energy versus useful energy, let's say, because I mean the problem is that a lot of the primary energy, which is like lumps of coal and liters of petrol, is wasted by the sheer laws of thermodynamics, that generating into heat and then generating into electricity, or generating into heat in an internal combustion engine and then moving the car. 70% of that energy is actually wasted. Whereas if you electrify that, you electrify power, so the electrons are coming from a photovoltaic panel and going to a light bulb or going into an electric car, and there's a lot less energy wastage. So the electrification process of the whole energy system makes it dramatically more efficient during the century. So as you decarbonize, you actually need to produce a lot less primary energy. So if you're trying to replace the total amount of primary energy we're using today, you're actually probably seeking to achieve the wrong thing and making it appear much harder than it might actually be.
It's like the goalpost is shifting as you're going toward it. And that obviously makes it very complicated to have a simple measure of how you're doing. Are you getting closer? How fast are you getting closer? That's basically what we're talking about. But right now, it's really not possible to calculate that accurately, and needs to become possible, because really this is the number that we should be focusing on when we're talking about, are we making progress to a safe climate or not? And, without this ability, we're kind of flying blind here. And so that's ultimately, I think, what we hope to accomplish with this, is to call on the experts who produce these numbers to produce these numbers in a form that we can all agree on and that can be used to measure progress and even set progress goals toward this safer climate future where we have 100% clean energy.
Yeah, I mean, Kwesi, you were in charge of running the numbers, and it kept us up late tonight. I think it would be safe to say.
Yeah.
Notifications.
Yeah. We spent a lot of late nights on this thing.
Yeah. Memorable ones. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I think that's literally the challenge. As I said, even defining these terms was a little bit of a challenge. Someone will say, you should add fossils, and you should do it this way. And then even estimating primary energy, you could see, but that's a differently, that's a differently. There are different assumptions on how the substitution is done. And as Erle succinctly said, we need to standardize these things. We should have a way of saying, this is how it's done, and this is how we expect it to be done. And until then, we'll keep on running around chasing our tails, because that will not get us to where or how actionable we want things to be. We want the policymaker to be able to say, oh, okay, I can track these numbers. These are standardized way of tracking these numbers. A policymaker in Africa should be able to track the numbers. A policymaker in the US, in Europe, should all be able to track the numbers, and they should arrive at the same answer. And that is really going to be important going forward.
And this even gives this ability, and this again happens because of things that we've learned from other types of indicators of progress like this, is that people can get competitive. You can see, like, this country's doing really well. Why can't we do as well as them? What are they doing that is getting them to 100% clean so fast, or getting their clean energy shift up so high? What are they doing? So we can learn from each other. And honestly, that form of competition, look at what the US is doing. They are so far behind the progress curve. We're all up here high on the clean energy shift, and this country is lagging behind. I mean, this kind of international process is actually pretty powerful. You don't want to necessarily be looking like the worst country in the world for something, although, it does depend on the politics of that country. Still, it gives if for anything that you use in the international realm, like international climate policy, having a kind of a number that defines progress that everyone can see every year is really a very useful, not just a measure of progress, but also promotes effort. There's a kind of a payback for being better at elevating your CES.
Absolutely, because progress is defined upwards. And I think that narrative reframing is actually really critical. Whereas net zero is about stopping doing something and getting to zero and eliminating it. And actually what politicians want to do is to deliver growth and prosperity and energy abundance. And actually clean energy shift, I think, works strongly with that narrative, because the race is upwards towards 100. and you've got to grow clean energy as fast as possible, which means investment. It means more solar, more wind, more nuclear, more geothermal. All of the clean energy technologies have to be upscaled as dramatically as possible, and that's an exciting thing to do, which involves innovation and prosperity. And all. So I actually think the narrative reframing here is actually quite critical and is a reason really why it could be more attractive to policymakers as a metric.
Yeah, I agree.
Good. Do you want to expand on that, Kwesi?
No, I think you've said enough. And I mean, we just have to let policymakers know that it's not all doom and gloom. We still can do this in a way that is sensible, as Elle will say. It should be sensible enough.
Well, the reality is, right, is that us global change scientists, or I'm a global change scientist, I mostly study ecology, but, we're very tuned into what's going on with global change on the planet. We're kind of behind the curve in understanding what's going on with popular efforts, popular understanding of what's going on this planet. And the idea that it's all about doom and gloom climate change and not about one of the most exciting transitions in human history, the transition to clean energy, is really what's driving so much of the economies around the world. Politically, it's much more exciting. It's something that people can get on board with rather than just kind of repeat after me. We're doomed because we're past 1.5. Instead of that kind of model, we're talking about what can we actually do to end global climate change? This is what will do it. And it's something that people want. Like, people actually like clean energy. Anybody who's had an electric car will tell you electric cars are awesome. Electrified societies are better. Some countries have grasped this. In fact, the places where you see this growing in some of the most rapidly is places like China and India, where they are on board with this. There's no reason to build all that dirty energy infrastructure because the clean stuff is both better and cheaper now. And so we really are seeing this transition that, watching from the outside, just thinking about global change, we're not really so aware of necessarily in our kind of ivory towers, but out there in the real world, this is happening.
Quite absolutely. Thanks, Elf. Kwesi, is it happening in Africa too? Do you think this is as relevant in sub-Saharan Africa as it might be in China or elsewhere?
That's a great point. So in Africa, I think it's slow in the sense that government don't subsidize some of these things. For instance, if I want to get a photovoltaic cell for my home in Ghana, I would have to pay top dollar for it. Whereas government could put in incentives like, okay, Kwesi, if you go this way, I'm going to give you maybe 30% discount on even the import duties. And then when you come in and then you give to the grid or you give somebody some power, you donate to the grid, then there are some subsidies. That is not happening in Africa. So that is a little bit slow. But I think that is going to catch up because we have a younger generation who want everything clean. Interestingly, they want everything clean. They are eating well, they are exercising, they are putting in all the hard work. And so it is so easy for those people to say, hey, I want to go green and then get an electric car. And I think that is going to happen. It's going to catch up, but it's a little bit slow to say.
I mean, we talked to Ember a bit when we were running the numbers on this, and they were very helpful in writing this paper. If you trust their numbers, solar plus batteries in sunny countries, so most of the tropics and most of the developing world, frankly, is now the cheapest option, cheaper than fossil, cheaper than any of the competitors. And so actually the incentive for any government is to reduce import duties on cheap Chinese solar panels to zero and get that energy installed as rapidly as possible. And it really is taking off in lots of countries. It's huge now in Pakistan. It's also increasingly dealing with the fact that the grid isn't even reliable in many African countries. You've got long blackouts and people have got diesel generators, and so actually the solar revolution, I think, is going to completely transform this picture much more rapidly than people perhaps appreciate. And actually, this is Ember's analysis, shows that if you look at just the electricity system, clean actually did outgrow total demand just last year. So it's not the whole energy system, because you've got transport and you've got the other sectors to think about, but just looking at power production, electricity, clean is already outgrowing total, and you're already seeing a peak in power sector or electricity generation emissions, largely driven by China, which is really, really an incredible story. So the fact that we're proposing this metric which goes with this enormous, exciting transition, which is already well underway. I think, goes with the momentum of current events, hopefully, as long as you can ignore the United States, which is doing its best to refossilize and bring down how do you
it's
feel living there?
remarkable how much some countries can be on the wrong side of history. But this is not just a political movement here. This is obviously something that is driven partly just by what people want and what people can afford. What's the best technology to make your energy in terms of cost? Stuff like that it's hard to beat that. That's kind of a way, it's a history changing kind of transition that's already going on. It's already well underway. It's not going to go back.
I think what the criticisms might be, or what people's concerns about this, I think a lot of people who have spent a lot of time on trying to work out what the temperature implications are of certain emissions scenarios and so on, I think they're going to look at this paper and say, well, what's the temperature outcome of the pathway you're proposing for this clean energy shift? I mean, we decided not to run any future numbers because we just didn't have the data to really base a useful projection on. But does that mean we've got nothing to say about the future temperature, or or are we still seeking an outcome here which makes sense to the kind of climate community? Oh, what's your take on this? I know you'll have a...
Well, for the last, I don't know, really since I finished my PhD in 1990, there's been this increasing interest in, making the science of climate change, understanding how the whole Earth system functions and produces climate has been a huge emphasis. It's a whole industry, and people have built their whole careers on trying to understand, for example, what happens to CO2 in the trees of the world and how that will affect temperature and all these kinds of complexities. And from this kind of community, you get solutions that are oriented toward their science. For example, you could argue that if we just planted enough trees, we could solve global climate change. And, if we had another planet worth of land to work with, not just the limited land we actually have, maybe that's a reasonable idea. But the truth is that industrial burning of fossil carbon is much bigger than what the biosphere can do. And that's why we're basically overwhelming the climate system, and it is shifting. And for that reason, the whole idea that we're just going to chip away at what's going on with the industrial world, burning all this fossil fuel by kind of turning a little lever on trees and a little lever on soils and doing a little bit here and there, this kind of chipping away approach, and this, we have to manage the entire carbon budget for the planet. That's how we're going to solve this problem, is both a kind of hubris, like, are we really serious? Like, do we really understand well enough to turn all these knobs and get it working when we can't even manage something like what people are doing themselves, which has got no natural analog, right? We're burning fossil fuels in all these factories. The idea that somehow that's too complicated. We won't just focus on that. We'll focus on everything at once. That's a problem in itself. We need to focus on what people can do to end this problem. And the fortunate thing is that almost 90% of this problem is basically burning fossil fuels, which is something that we have a solution to burning fossil fuels. Now, there's some hard to do things like flying airplanes without jet fuel is not something we have solved very well. And maybe that will be one of the last things we solve. But making electricity has been solved. There are much cleaner ways to make electricity, many different kinds of ways. And there's ways of powering vehicles that don't require burning petroleum. There's so many solutions that we actually already have. And the cool thing is the marketplace has already recognized, wow, this is actually pretty profitable and is also moving in that direction. So it's kind of like, this is where societies are headed. They're toward this better, cleaner future. And it's time to kind of get the climate community back to reality. We are not managing the whole planet. We're never going to manage all the planet in detail. Let's focus on solving this challenge of fossil fuel combustion at its root, which is we have to go to 100% clean energy economies.
Mm. And as you said, Earl, you looked at the numbers, and the carbon dioxide problem is 90% of that is fossil fuels. It's not coming from all these other places. And I guess people might also object, well, why aren't you dealing with agriculture and the food system and methane and nitrous oxide, all of that? And I think we're arguing actually just back off a bit. And these are specific problems that need to be dealt with in specific ways. And so taking a more, I think they call it a sectoral approach, is actually a better, because if you complicate all this stuff together and you have this basket of CO2e and you have all of these different gases and you have to work out their global warming potentials and somehow they're interchangeable and fungible. Actually, that's not really the case. And I think it overcomplicates the climate system, or the climate problem rather, if you've got all of the tradability between all these different gases and things like that, because they're all different things doing, coming in different ways and affecting the climate differently.
It's actually funny, this idea that we hear a lot, which is that 1.5 degrees is such a wonderful target because it's so simple. Because everyone knows what temperature is, and well, of course, 1.5 degrees doesn't seem like much because every day, almost everywhere, it goes up and down by more than that. But the bottom line is temperature is something we understand. And the idea is, well, global temperature then is something we can manage. But in fact, it's not the case. It is much too complicated to actually manage unless we go to something like sulfate aerosols and cooling the planet, which has its own dangers, as we know. So the idea that, keep it simple is probably the number one thing you say. You want to solve a problem, the solution, keep it simple as you can make it. That's what we're talking about here. Focusing on clean energy, the clean energy system, the clean energy economy. This is keeping it simple. The idea of managing everything that can produce or take up greenhouse gases is just way beyond our pay grade. Human societies aren't going to be able to manage all this. We can manage our energy systems because we made them, we built them, and we're building them every day.
This actually speaks to the root cause of the issue, the fossil issue, in the sense that we have to go to the first principles, the root cause. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a large wound, a big wound. That is not going to help, because if we really want to get a planet that is livable, then we need to go to the root cause. And there are so many ways or opportunities for us to advance the science in that relation. As Erle said, we've already looked at how we can power cars without fossils. So definitely in the next line of action, there will be other things that we could do to sustainably move away from fossils. And then once we tackle it from the first principle, from the root cause, then we have a chance, rather than managing superficially to keep the temperature down. Because naturally, if we're able to tackle the first principles, those other things will naturally flow together, and then we'll have a livable planet. Yeah.
And there will be co-benefits as well, right? Because half the methane that goes into the atmosphere comes from oil and gas infrastructure. So if that's being eliminated, then that will also address the methane problem. Maybe the same with nitrous oxide, some of these other greenhouse gases as well, which are related to fossil fuel use overall. But I think the broader point remains that we're not trying to manage the Earth system in some kind of totally complex way. It's really just a case of dealing with this very specific issue, which is humanity pumping a lot of carbon out of the Earth's crust into the Earth's atmosphere. And stopping
Let's be clear, it's not humanity doing this. There are so many people in this world who cannot afford to burn any fossil fuels at all and are not contributing to the problem at all. They are humanity.
Like Africa, for instance.
So many Africans, so many Asians. There's plenty of people in this world who are not contributing to global climate change. To call it a problem of humanity is to actually give away the reality that it is some people doing this. It's not everybody.
No, you're
that's
absolutely
really
right.
important, I think, is that
Absolutely
we have to assign responsibility for what is causing this challenge. And it's those who are burning fossil fuels. And of course, I'm as guilty as anyone. But the reality is, do I want to go to the store, the gas station, say, and buy dirty energy for my car? I don't want that. Nobody wants that. Nobody chose that. It's just convenient. It's convenient energy. Now that when you change your energy system so that you can have, for example, an electric car, people prefer that. It's clean. It's not causing damage. Actually easier to use in a lot of ways. It's got some challenges still, but those are getting worked out quickly. So the idea that nobody really wants dirty energy, they just want cheap energy. And so clean is always going to trump dirty if it's, for example, at the same price or close. And so that's where we're at now. That's kind of the tipping point that really matters is are we at that point where basically everyone can have access to cheap energy without destroying the climate system?
And we weren't there 10 years ago. We weren't there 5 years ago, maybe not even 2 years ago. we weren't able to say to developing countries, actually, going for clean energy is your cheapest option. That's your best option now, is to avoid, essentially
Nobody has to tell developing countries. They know what the price of things are, and they are they're acting accordingly. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, you can see that in the figures. I mean, these countries are leapfrogging the fossil fuels age because it's now the cheapest option to get plentiful energy. And that was always the conundrum, was like, yes, the developed countries and rich people in developed countries, of course, the climate problem, that's where the historical responsibility lies, as you point out, Earl. But if developing countries want to have the same levels of development and energy abundance and economic prosperity that we've enjoyed in the West for so long, thanks to fossil fuels, aren't they going to have to burn fossil fuels too? And that was always the conundrum at the heart of the climate problem that's basically stopped there ever being a solution to it until now, when clean energy, if it can outgrow energy demand, as we suggest it should continue to do for our clean energy shift, that's actually pointing towards a solution to this problem. So I'm optimistic now in a way that I've not been for a really long time. I mean, back in 2008, I published this book called 6 Degrees, and it was game over. It was kind of Armageddon. It was, it was dystopian future we were looking at, going even, 3, 4, certainly 5, 6 degrees was absolute kind of global wipeout, mass extinction time, including for humans. Now I think the argument is which side of 2 degrees we're going to end up on. And the way that we can determine the outcome there is to get as much clean energy built as we possibly can on a year-to-year basis. That's sort of what we're proposing here.
It's like the paradox of our time is that we're going past this target that has been promoted as the limits of safety for the climate system. So that narrative is very much like that is an end of the world kind of scenario. And some important people have actually said things like, we are passing the ability of societies to adapt to climate change. We're getting that far. The climate is changing that much that we're really at this kind of point of no return and extreme danger. At the same time that we've actually developed a real solution space for this we're on the road. We are actually finally there's a clear path to 100% clean energy. I mean, it's disturbing that we have both things going on at the same time. At the same time, we can have both narratives, and we have to shift that narrative. If we want people to be actively doing things for the climate, for themselves, but for the climate system as well, we can't just keep talking about 1.5 degrees and how hot the planet is. We need to talk about how fast are we and can we move toward this clean energy future.
Adding to Erle's that, and efficiently tracking that progress, that is key, because when people see there is progress, they become more excited to even achieve more. Yeah.
And so, with this is actually quite complementary potentially with the COP process. And so we're saying literally when they go to Turkey or Australia or wherever the next future COPs are, policymakers could literally look at the clean energy shift and say, right, it was at 5%, and actually was at about 5.7% according to our numbers in 2024. If we hold on that number, or even get it up to 6%, or get it up to 7% by 2028 or something, I mean, that's an exciting prospect, right? And it's also a meaningful number because we know that if we can drive this clean energy shift upwards, we're decarbonizing the global economy at a faster rate. It's not the same as saying, well, you're going to be at 1.8 or 2 degrees or 2.1 or anything specific like that. But it's actually a number which is something that policymakers can look at and deliver in real time. And we're almost, speaking of real time, we're almost at time now. But I'd like to hear from both of you as co-authors. What do you want to see next with this idea that we're putting out there in Nature this week?
So I think that I am excited to recalculate the CES on using very reliable numbers. It will be nice for us to, as a follow-up, maybe together with other colleagues, to do this in the sense that it puts numbers and reality to people and policymakers. It helps them say that, okay, this is how far we've come. This is how far we've done before. And this is doable. And that narrative will shift a lot of thinking and perception towards, oh, we can do this. It wouldn't be doom and gloom. Oh, we've already hit 1.5. By 2 degrees, we are all gone. That kind of story should shift to positivity. And we can only win this battle by positivity. when the younger generation thinks that, oh, there is hope to do this, we can do this, they can carry it on. But if they feel that, oh, there's no hope, then they give up. And then we fail in achieving a livable planet. So that is my thinking. Next is to put the numbers to the concept that we've proposed, and also to see the reaction from policymakers into how they can translate that into their own regional perspectives. Yeah.
Thanks, Kwesi. Earle, what about you? What's next going forward?
So for me, this was a really interesting learning process. We started off with this very simple idea that the better future means 100% clean energy. So how do we measure progress toward 100% clean energy in a way that everyone in the world could see it globally and nationally? Simple thing, it seemed. It turns out that the IEA, the International Energy Agency, does not release data appropriate to do this, even though they do apparently have it. So opening that data to scholars and countries around the world is fundamentally important. We need access to the data that's already being collected, not behind a paywall. The second is that I would like to see a standard, and IEA is the institution that's best positioned to create a standard for calculating things like percent clean energy and making a long-term clean energy and total energy demand predictions that we can use. And I hope it will be used by the IEA and EMBER and other groups to produce the Clean Energy Shift Index and make that public for every country in the world, both going back in time and through projections into the future about possible pathways. That's what I would like to see as a result of this work.
Definitely. And just to restate the challenge, we've got to be able to quantify in absolute numbers, so in exajoules or terawatt hours or whatever you want. And it's got to ideally be useful energy. So that's not lumps of coal, and it's not got all of these efficiency losses, but literally the energy that's being used at the consumer end, really, whether it's electrons going into a chip in a data center or lumens coming out of a light bulb or something. But that's actually more, I mean, they like to count the top-down stuff because it's much easier to count, the crude oil going through, coming out of wells and going into ships and going into the energy system and huge amounts of coal and so on, than it is to actually count electrons at the point of use in the whole global economy. So we understand, I think, why that's difficult, but you do also need to count the thing that really matters, which is energy doing work, moving people around, lighting people's houses, heating and so on. And in fact, that reminds me, heat pumps, they harvest energy from the environment and so you get a 300% efficiency increase potentially with a heat pump. So electricity actually is delivering 3 times more energy through heat than you're putting in. So that's not in prime energy numbers either. So all of this needs to be properly counted and accounted for, and that data needs to be made publicly available so that we can actually calculate this clean energy shift in real time, and also have useful numbers to project going forwards, where we can say, well, we need the CES to be, 6% or 8% or 12% or whatever the number happens to be, if you want to totally defossilize the world economy by whatever point it is in the future. And then people can start doing their, big global climate model projections and say, well, that's going to take us to 1.8 or 2.1 or whatever it happens to be. But I think that's the way the pathway could potentially be built, and because people will want to know really how rapidly we need to decarbonize and where that's going to land the planet. I mean, I think that's reasonable, don't you, Earle? I mean, you're a bit perhaps more down on the kind of global climate modeling.
I'm most concerned that the world has a simple measure of progress toward 100% clean energy planet. That's how we should be thinking about what the future should be like. And the faster we get there, the less harm we're going to do to the climate system. And so the world needs this measure of progress. We need to know where we are on the curve. We need to know how fast we can go. We need to know what makes it go faster, all these things. But it all requires a simple measure that's agreed upon by every country, that this is the measure of how clean our energy system is, and how much, which of course the opposite of it is talking about how dirty it is and how much damage it's going to do to the rest of the planet. And having an eye on which countries are doing what, that's what will help us guide us toward this future. And it has to be something everyone can understand, even if everyone's not going to understand exajoules, but everyone can understand percent clean. There's a lot of complexity there, and I've learned a lot about that complexity, but that doesn't help in the big picture. It's up to the experts to come up with something they can commonly agree on represents the consensus on progress toward clean energy, 100% clean energy future.
And then just to wrap up, I was going to say that in addition to having the open data and reformulating our energy definition, we actually also need to have clean energy targets in the UNFCCC discussions. It would be really nice if it's able to penetrate that discussions and people will see that, okay, there's an alternative way of doing this. And that would be really nice. And of course, as we said, R&D investments are really important to be able to transition faster and quicker into clean energy targets, getting to 100% clean energy. We need innovation, and that will come by investment from investors and other people thinking outside the box to be able to make that happen. Yeah.
And just because I rather messed up this in the introduction at the beginning, what is the bad idea that we're saving the world from with this paper?
In my perspective, the bad idea is that a target, a limit to temperature change is the metric that we should use to talk about getting people to cooperate to end global climate change. I would argue that this was always a relatively short-sighted effort, because there was going to come a time, even when people came up with this idea, they knew that it was very unlikely that we would be able to keep the planet under 1.5 degrees. So now that we're going beyond that level, the message that it's sending to the world is that we have failed to address dangerous climate change. And in a sense, once you failed, who's going to get on board with that project? That was not well thought out, in my opinion. But we now have an alternative here, and this alternative wasn't likely as possible back in 2015, right? Which is that we can focus our attention on decarbonizing the world's economies in a way that is actually already underway. We're not just forcing the world to change. We're actually just trying to enhance a process that's already going on, that's already succeeding. And that kind of thing gets people interested in participating and enhancing the cooperation that we need to actually end global climate change.
Right. And you're on board with that, Kwesi. 1.5 to stay alive was always a bad idea.
It was. I agree totally. It was. In the long, in hindsight, they were bringing a temporary fix, in my opinion, to say, hey, don't get to 2 degrees. What can we do? Mitigate to 1.5. But in hindsight, that was very wrong because nobody cares about global mean temperatures. They are rather concerned about the risk associated with the temperatures that they feel regionally. So it's always impact. It's always impact. And it has always been impact. Yeah.
Well, I wrote a book about global average mean temperatures called 6 Degrees, and I had a chapter for each one, which I think is defensible because each chapter outlined the impacts that we thought might happen according to climate models and paleoclimate and so on at each temperature. So it was an attempt to try to make it real and to make the global average temperature thing a bit more meaningful in terms of, like, it would lead to floods, it would lead to this drought, it would lead to X, Y, and Z impacts in certain places at certain times. But I agree now, it seems in hindsight to have been a bad idea, probably because we've missed it and because it is intangible, and nobody by definition experiences global average mean temperature. So yes, let's move on and let's really focus on the thing that is this extraordinary clean energy transformation, which is now underway, which it wasn't until very recently. So let's build on the success that the world's already seeing on a year-to-year basis in decarbonizing the economy through bringing large amounts of clean energy to the world's population, especially to the developing world. I want to thank you both, Erle Ellis and Kwesi Quagraine, for your co-authorship of this amazing paper, which is out in Nature this week. And I think my email is the corresponding address, but we will all be tackling correspondence, whether it's criticisms, feedback of any sort, further conceptual improvements of what we're putting forward. We'd love to hear it, so please do get in touch. But for now, from all of us, I think it's goodbye. Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a We Planet podcast. We Planet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review. It helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.